I really wish I remembered the attribution for this quote, but it stuck with me regardless. So one time a very famous artist was asked, how long did it take you to do one of those thumbnail sketches? And instead of saying the truth, which was it took, 30 seconds, what they said was, it took me my entire career. Now, obviously they were not being literal, but their point is an important one. The thumbnail sketch on its own does more than the sum of its lines. What it's doing is it's simplifying a very complicated idea in a really small package, a very quick execution. But then when the artist looks at it, they remember the much more detailed thing in their imagination. So a thumbnail sketch can only be done after years of experience of drawing the long version. Well, the same is true for lighting and rendering. What I'm going to be advocating in these next videos relies on the fact that you know how to render for real. In order to do the shorthand version or the reduced, simplified version, you have to be able to do the real thing first. Long story short, we're about to fake it. And faking it only really works if you're good at actually doing it right in the first place. Okay, so what two major things are we going to fake with this sort of lighting and rendering? The first and most important one is form. And form is simply shadow describing the way an object exists in 3D space. So you have a spotlight on an object, it casts a shadow, it has form shadows, and our brain looks at those things and understands the three-dimensional shape or form of the object. Okay, this is what really adds information quickly to a drawing. What were flat lines a moment ago now give body and dimension with just a little bit of form information. So here with these paint tubes, all I'm doing with the marker is indicating form. I am faking a light source. The light source doesn't exist in this scene. I'm just kind of throwing one in there. And the way that I'm applying the paint is pretty straightforward. Just like I showed in the last video, I'm just doing temporary layers. So I'll start with the biggest shapes first. I'll apply large areas of pigment. And then generally speaking, I will remove pigment with a soft eraser. So for me, the way I like to do it happens to be add pigment with a hard brush, remove it with a soft brush, and you get good control that way. Now, this part is totally personal preference. But don't be distracted by the way that I'm applying the paint. The real important thing I'm doing here is I am imagining a light source. And once I've practiced and learned a lot about lights, I'm able to pretty convincingly make these look like three-dimensional paint tubes. This is faking it. I'm not looking at reference. I didn't make a 3D render as an example. This is just combining all of my history and experience with doing still life drawings and doing life drawing and really understanding lighting. Now I can kind of fake it well enough that it looks convincing. And I'm intentionally using very, very simple objects here to serve as the first example. And if you're new to this, this is what I'd suggest for you. Starting with a essentially cylinder with a few bumps here and there, is a really great way to test kind of the basics of this technique. But truly, the best way to practice this, especially if you're new to it, is to start with photo reference. So here I have a slightly more complicated form, and I have already done the line drawing for all these examples. Let's not focus on lines for now. You have your sketch, you have the photo reference. Now all we're trying to do is simplify the light and shadow. Now clearly the photo has a whole range of values. There's the very dark cast shadow, and then on the red hinge itself, the shadows are a little bit lighter. We're going to ignore all that for now. Remember, we're simplifying. We have one marker. It's not really a marker, but you get my meaning. And with this flat tone, I'm going to describe all of the shadows. So the first low-hanging fruit, the very easy choice, is the cast shadow. Of course, we're going to include the cast shadow. But then it becomes a question of which shadows in this photograph are essential for describing this object three-dimensionally. I'm not trying to reproduce the photo. It's not a photo study in that sense. What I'm trying to do is give it a little more of a believable 3D nature, trying to make it pop off the page. In a sense, I'm sculpting with light. That's the way that I'm describing the 3D form, is I'm using shadows and the areas of dark and areas of light to describe the three-dimensional qualities of this object. And you get better at this with practice. There's a reason that I do a lot of studies from photos, studies from observation. This is how you cement those general rules of thumb. And then once you've figured out some things that generally work a certain way, then when you go to design your own subject matter, it's so much easier. You already know what happens when a cylinder is hit by a spotlight. You've seen it 100 times and you've done those studies. So you can think of a study like this one as an opportunity to learn how basic shapes exist in light. And then you file away those lessons you learned for another day when you're going to not have photo reference and you have to be able to imagine this stuff. So with all that said, how would I approach a beetle like this one? Is it cylinders? Is it rectangles? Not exactly. It's obviously an organic form, but we can apply all those same basic rules. Like, I generally know that I'm going to fill with a hard brush first, and then I'm going to erase away to indicate the roundness of the form. So I want to start with this big major shape as my first element. And, it takes a little bit of precision to get those edges in, and then you just fill in the rest. Now it comes time to erasing it away and explaining that form. So I'll use a big brush, and I'm going to erase away essentially the highest area of the 3D form that's pointing at the light source. And then as it gets into these smaller forms, I have to be more specific about the way that I erase. But you can see really quickly there, it went from being very flat to giving a general sense of form. Now, is it perfect? Is it absolutely realistic? Probably not. But it works well enough. And this is what I'm talking about with sort of faking it well enough. You learn the lessons by doing photo studies when you have essentially the answer to look at. But then when it comes to your real sketches, like this beetle, you don't have an answer. There's really no way to know if you're going to light it just right. So you have to trust in your experience and in those lessons you've learned in your studies to apply them to whatever subject matter you might invent. But all the same technical lessons apply. I'm using tone in the exact same way I did on the hinge. This just happens to be something with no photo reference. So this, again, is why those studies are so important. Especially as a beginner, I think you can look at a subject like this and think, ooh, that's pretty detailed, that's pretty tricky. But what I'm doing mentally is quickly reducing this into essentially cylinders, spheres, basic things that I understand the rules for. Because when I do the hinge study, it's not so I know how to draw hinges in the future. What I'm looking at is essentially cylinders in space. And so what I'm filing away in my mind is how the light falls on top of basic geometric objects. The fact that it's called a hinge is really not important, because at a glance there's not much similar between a hinge and a beetle. But when you simplify them into geometric objects, they become a lot more similar, and then you can apply the same rules. All right, so now let's up the ante. You're thinking, all right, I was with you on the beetle. The beetle's pretty cylindrical. This is a totally different story. This tank is very complicated. There's no way I could invent a simple toning solution. Well, that is not true. This is all very basic shapes if you're willing to mentally simplify it. And so you're going to apply tone in the exact same way. I don't want to dwell too much on the specifics of how I'm envisioning this light. This is really something I talk more about in Basic Rendering 2, and I encourage you to check that out. But the fact is, these rules are very versatile, and the things you learn on a hinge apply just as effectively to something very complicated like this tank. It takes a little longer to describe the form, and you can see here I'm just getting started, but let's flash forward to the ending, and you can see that there's no difference. It's the same steps repeated over and over. I'm using a single tone for all the shadows on the entire tank. It gives it a nice, clean, graphic look. It gives much more information than the line drawing did on its own, but ultimately, it's shorthand. This is simplified light. It's great for sketching. Now, if we flash back a bit, you might remember I talked about thumbnail sketches using cast shadows, but also graphic shapes, just to kind of make an object pop out from the page. Well, in this example, I'm going to do the same thing with my tank. I'm going to use the same single tone I've been using for all the shadows. And now I've gone ahead and selected the shape of the tank ahead of time just to make this a little easier. But the idea here is I'm just going to put a big graphic shape in the background. The reason I'm doing it at the top of this composition and not at the bottom is because I was sort of losing the silhouette and it was a little hard to see the shape of those top elements. And then the design works better as a single page layout. It makes it, a unified composition. But again, the whole thing is one tone. And if you have something that is very simplified and almost posterized like this, then it can be kind of fun to go ahead and do some post-processing, and really quickly with a few tweaks in Photoshop, you can take what was white and gray and turn it into something that looks more like a blueprint. But that's a discussion for another time. The essential lesson I want to leave you with in this chapter is that form matters. In my opinion, form is one of the most important aspects of sketching with tone. So doing a still life like this one is a really great way to practice that. The objects in this case do have their own materials, and some are shiny, some are flat. They all have different colors. But for this exercise, I'm ignoring all of that. What I'm doing is I'm looking at the photo reference, and all I care about is the light falling across the objects. I'm focusing on the core shadows and the cast shadows, because these are the lessons that I'm going to need to apply to who knows what subject matter in the future. But the wonderful thing about still lifes is that they are three-dimensional objects in space, and light is falling across them, which means they teach you invaluable lessons that you can use for your entire career. It doesn't matter that one happens to be porcelain, one happens to be a pear. What I'm looking at is light. So I really encourage you to do drawings like these. The way I created this one was actually to take a photo, and then I traced the photo to get my line work because I wasn't focusing on lines. All I wanted was lighting. I want to practice my lighting because I want to learn those lessons that I can apply in the future. And then once you've got your traced photo ready to go, pick a single tone, and you can use whatever kind of brushes you want, but you're just using a single tone for the shadows, and then light your whole scene. And if one still life went pretty well, do a second still life, do a third still life. This is one of the best things you can practice when it comes to just making believable 3D objects. And I understand it's not the sexiest subject matter in the world. It's not all that exciting. But take my word for it, this is how you improve.